The Invisible Front. The War of Money. This war wasn't won only on the battlefields. The real victory was decided in vaults, in banks, and in rooms filled with gold. We remember World War I for its blood, its mud, its soldiers. But behind all that, there was a silent front. The financial war. Gold reserves, bond markets, central bank chambers. They became weapons far more powerful than cannons. Soldiers paid in blood. But bankers and governments were fighting their own kind of war, a war written in numbers and balance sheets. And the choices made back then didn't just decide who won. They shaped the financial system we still live under today. So this war wasn't only fought with armies or politics. It was won with money. If you think war is just about generals and soldiers, think again. World War I taught humanity one brutal truth. Money is also a weapon, and often it's the deadliest one of all. 1914. Europe on the edge of explosion. In 1914, Europe was like a barrel of gunpowder, ready to explode at any moment. Nations were flexing their pride, chasing colonies, and drowning in mutual suspicion. But behind all these loud speeches of honor and empire hid a truth no one wanted to admit. A war like this was insanely expensive. Here's the simple truth. When a country goes to war, its people start paying for it. When leaders choose war, their citizens inherit the debt. Every soldier marching to the front meant another burden on the backs of ordinary families. At first, most governments thought the war would be short. Maybe it'll be over by Christmas, they said. They believed it could be paid for the old-fashioned way, with a little gold, a little borrowing, and a little patriotism from the people. But they were wrong. Terribly wrong. Because the war began to devour money faster than anyone could imagine. Every day, on every front, it was as if nations were firing shells made of gold. The gold standard. A system, breaking its chains. In the summer of 1914, Europe's money still ran on the gold standard. Paper money had value because it could be exchanged for gold. That gave people confidence. But it also tied the hands of governments. Gold was limited. You couldn't just print endless money, because trust, whether from citizens, investors, or even the army, was built on gold. But once millions of soldiers were mobilized and factories shifted to producing guns, shells, and ammunition, costs exploded. By the end of 1914, Germany was spending 10 million marks a day. Britain was burning through 2.5 million pounds daily. The math was brutal. Gold couldn't keep up. And one by one, governments broke the rule. They suspended the gold standard. Money was no longer backed by real value, only by the word of the state. That moment changed everything. It was one of the biggest economic turning points in history. Because for the first time, nations realized something dangerous. Money wasn't metal. It was belief. And belief could be printed. From that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. Wealth was no longer measured in gold, but in printing presses, credit, and promises. And once governments tasted that kind of freedom, they never gave it up. After all, once you learn how easy it is to spend without limits, there's no going back. Germany. A pyramid built on hope for Germany, the war wasn't just fought on the front lines. It was a battle for survival at home, too. Global markets were closed. The British Navy blockaded the ports and money had stopped flowing. The country was suffocating. So Berlin came up with a solution. Borrow from its own people. A massive campaign began. War bonds. Posters showed brave soldiers, waving flags, heroic slogans. The message was simple. Give your savings, sell your gold, invest in victory. And millions believed. Families emptied their savings, sold jewelry, even their children's future funds, all for the fatherland. Germany raised over 100 billion marks. But this system was built on faith, not reality. And when defeat came, that faith collapsed. The bonds became worthless. Millions of people saw their life savings vanish overnight. The heartbreak and anger that followed would later grow into something darker, because history doesn't just live in the records of the winners. It's also written in the ledgers of those who lost. Britain and America. An alliance built on money, Britain had one major advantage. London was the beating heart of global finance. The pound was trusted, and British banking was the oldest and most respected in the world. At first, Britain managed the war with short-term bonds and patriotic donations, but soon the cost became unimaginable. And the answer lay across the ocean. The United States was officially neutral, but its bankers had already picked a side. Giant firms like J.P. Morgan and Company organized massive loans for Britain and France. Weapons, food, raw materials, all financed by American money. By 1917, when the U.S. finally entered the war, Wall Street had already become the war's financial headquarters. This wasn't charity. It was a transfer of power. American bankers made fortunes, and for the first time in history, the United States became the world's biggest creditor. The so-called American century didn't start on the battlefield. It began in the balance books. France and Russia. In the shadow of debt, France entered the war already exhausted. Decades of defense spending, the trauma of past defeats, and a weak economy weighed heavily. And when the war began, the solution was the same as always: borrow. The French were known for their thrift. The government used that trust, urging citizens to buy war bonds. Lend your savings to your country, they said. And people did. But the real money, once again, came from America. Like Britain, France became dependent on U.S. credit until the very end of the war. And that dependence became the seed of a new crisis after it ended. Because the debt didn't disappear, it just changed hands. The war was over, but the bill remained. Those debts set the stage for the economic collapses of the 1920s. Meanwhile, Russia was a disaster. On paper, it had gold reserves. In reality, the economy was broken and the banks were on the edge of collapse. The government kept printing money, prices exploded, and the ruble crumbled to dust. By 1917, the economy had fallen apart. The people were starving. And at that point, revolution ignited. It wasn't just ideology that toppled the Tsar. It was empty plates and lost hope. The cost of war. Mountains of debt. A broken order. When the war finally ended, the world faced the most expensive bill in history. The Allies had spent around $140 billion. The Central Powers, $60 billion more. At the time, those were numbers beyond imagination, many times greater than the annual income of most nations. The result? Mountains of debt, collapsed economies, and a gold standard that would never recover. Inflation became the war's second battlefield. Germany turned into the symbol of hyperinflation. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. People carried their wages in wheelbarrows, and as always, the first to suffer were ordinary savers. Small families lost everything. The wealthy, meanwhile, found ways to protect themselves. They moved their assets abroad, into gold, land, and hard property. Once again, history whispered the same cruel truth. When a financial war breaks out, it's always the people who lose the most. The Post-War World, A New Order, written in balance sheets. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the world lay in ruins, not just on the battlefields, but on the pages of financial ledgers. Before the war, the United States had been a debtor nation. But when it was over, America held the world's largest gold reserves and had become the planet's biggest creditor. Europe, meanwhile, was bleeding out. Britain, France, nearly every country on the continent, was drowning in debt. Britain owed the U.S. $4 billion. France owed $3. And then came a quiet revolution. The world's financial center shifted from London to New York. America had become the new financial empire without firing a single shot. But this wasn't just about money, because the war had been financed through debt, and that debt meant the war wasn't really over. It had just changed form. Versailles and Germany. The curse of debt Britain and France had promised their citizens that war bonds would be repaid. To make that happen, they turned their eyes to Germany. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to pay an impossible price, 132 billion gold marks in reparations. It was a number no nation could ever pay. But they were ordered to try. So, Germany did the only thing it could. It printed more money. The mark collapsed. People carried wages in baskets and carts. A single loaf of bread cost billions. And the people's anger, their hunger, their despair, all of it became the seed of a darker chapter that was yet to come. Because when an economy collapses, it's not just banks that fall. Faith, order, and hope collapse with them. Britain's mistake. Trying to revive old glory. After the war, Britain was desperate to protect its imperial pride. And in 1925, it made a grand decision. We're going back to the gold standard. But there was one big problem. The economy was in ruins. Industry was weak, debt was high, and unemployment was spreading fast. Still, the government was determined to restore the pound to its pre-war value. They wanted to prove that the empire's glory still meant something, but it was a disaster. Deflation hit. Businesses went bankrupt. Jobs vanished. Instead of recovery, Britain sank deeper into stagnation. Even today, economists call that decision one of the greatest mistakes in modern financial history. And as always, it wasn't the rich who paid the price, but the workers, the shopkeepers, and the ordinary people. America. Master of debt. When the United States emerged from the war, it held two powerful things: gold and credit. Armed with both, America began flooding Europe with money. It lent to Germany, so Germany could pay reparations to France. France could then repay Britain, and Britain could send the money back to the U.S. The money kept circling around the system, but no new wealth was actually being created. It was just the same debt passed from one hand to another. They called it the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan. On paper, it looked brilliant, but in reality, it was just buying time. And in 1929, that fragile illusion collapsed. The stock market crashed. Banks failed. And the world spiraled into the Great Depression. Once again, history whispered its warning. The players may change, but the cycle stays the same. The mirror of history. The same story from 1914 to 2008. World War I wasn't just a military conflict. It was the moment when the rules of the global economy were rewritten. Governments learned a powerful lesson. You didn't need real money to keep the system alive. You just needed a convincing story. When the gold was gone, they printed paper. When real value disappeared, they replaced it with faith and propaganda. And ever since, the game hasn't changed. Every crisis, every war, every temporary measure is just a new act in the same old play. The crash of 1929, the inflation of the 1970s, the financial meltdown of 2008, they all grew from the same root, temporary debts that became permanent. And today, governments are still saying the same words. The economy is strong. Inflation is temporary. But remember this. They said the exact same thing in 1914. And we all know how that story ended. What is real wealth? World War I gave humanity one of the harshest economic lessons in history. Real wealth isn't the numbers written on paper. Real wealth is knowledge, skills, production power, and the ability to endure crisis. Because every time a system collapses, every time a government calls for trust again, the first to pay the price are always the same. Ordinary people. Governments always find ways to finance wars and crises, but in the end, they hand the bill to us, to you, to me, to the people just trying to live. That's why history doesn't just tell stories about the past. It teaches survival. Final word. History doesn't repeat, but it whispers. History doesn't repeat itself word for word, but it never stops reminding us. The financial playbook written in 1914 is still being acted out today, just with new names and new words, and the ending is always the same. The powerful protect themselves. The uninformed pay the price. Because money can vanish, banks can collapse, governments can fall. But knowledge, skill, and real value, those never disappear. The truth always hides between the lines of balance sheets, and history is the only teacher that never lies. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.